نعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. قال الله تعالى في كتابه العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال يا إبليس ما لك ألا تكون مع الساجدين قال لم أكن لأسجد لبشر خلقته من صلصال من حمأ مسنون. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, all praise is due to Allah Azza wa Jalla, Lord of the worlds, and we ask Him to send His greatest peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and upon his family and his companions, and upon all the believers until the day of judgment. Ya Rabbil Alameen. One of the most dangerous things that we find in society is, in fact, one of the most powerful tools employed by the devil himself, is the idea of a half-truth. It's when you coax 90% of the story that is truth with the 10% falsehood you wish to manipulate people with. In a conversation that pans out between Allah and Iblis, the chief of the devils, when he asked him, why have you not prostrated when I ordered you? He says, Allah asked, oh Iblis, what is the matter with you that you did not join the others in prostration? After Allah gave the command of prostration, he refused. His reply is interesting. He says, he replied, it is not for me to prostrate to a human you created from sounding clay molded of black mud. Now that sentence, taken independently, is 100% true. We should not prostrate to a person who is made from mud. It makes no sense. If you were to prostrate to another human being, what value could that person give you that Allah cannot? Or what equality are you making between him and Allah? Iblis employs the art of the half-truth throughout his deceptions. And you see it time and time again. Now what's missing is, of course, when Allah commands you to do something, it's not for you to decide yes or no. It's not for you to rationalize whether you do it or you don't do it. But you obey and then try and understand why. Iblis, in another narration by the Prophet ﷺ, it was described, it's a lengthy hadith, but it was described that prior to the revelation of the Quran and prior to the coming of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the devils were granted access to the heavens. They could listen in to the messages being conveyed to the angels. But whenever they would hear a message, they would pass it on, but they would add their little bit. And it says they would add tis'an, they would add 9 to it, which can be the number 9, which we don't know what that means, or it can be extra additions to it. Until the advent of the Prophet ﷺ, at which point we see that verse Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in Surah Al-Rahman, يُسَى عَلَيْهُمْ جُهَابٌ مِّن نَّارٍ وَنُحَاسٌ فَلَا يَنْتَصِرَانِ, that he sends these rocks to stop them from listening in. But the devils and shaitan uses this idea of a half-truth. Brothers, and if you're in here, can you please cover your face with the face mask, as it's a requirement, inshallah, to be here, inshallah, for the safety of other people. There's some masks, I believe, outside if you do not have one. So the idea of a half-truth and manipulating what is truthful in order to take advantage for your own self is a common trick that shaitan employs. We wanted to do a kind of a little lesson for this for one of the groups, the youth groups that we run. It was a fun game, a little game called, it's like a box of lies. What you do is you bring an object and you tell a story associated with the object. Now you can either tell a truthful story or you can manipulate a lie to that story. And then the people have to guess, are you telling the truth or are you making up the story? The purpose of the exercise was to show how difficult it is to lie about something. If I was to tell you that I came in my car, it's very easy and straightforward. But if I wanted to come up with a lie to that, the more far-fetched it is, the more I lie, the less believable it becomes. But the art of the lie is when you do something that is all truthful, but you add a tiny addendum, a tiny thing to it that manipulates it. It's these half-truths that we have to be careful of. So, as an example, someone described a story of them purchasing this keyring, and everything was true about it, except it wasn't him that made the trip, it was his father. So the whole story was made out as if it was him, but he was telling it in the eyes of somebody else. In fact, Allah Azza wa Jal, when He describes falsehood, He mentions in the Quran, يهدي به الله من اتبع رضوانه سبل السلام ويخرجهم من الظلمات إلى النور. He describes falsehood as dhulumat, the plural of shadows. And as we know, a shadow can have multiple complexions, multiple intensities, multiple levels of darkness. Whereas the light is mentioned in the singular. When you have the truth there's only one truth. There's no variations on the truth. There's no different forms of what it can be. But you can either be in complete darkness and completely void of any truth, or you can mix and match somewhere in between. Now, why am I mentioning this idea of half-truths? Because you see this concept coming up and up again within both the hadith literature and the Islamic verses of the Quran and the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ warned us against false scholars, people who speak the truth but for a false reason or manipulate the truth, people who will convince you with the most eloquent words and the most convincing arguments, but there's that 10% that they don't disclose, that's the manipulative element as to why this is not true. You see it with the coronavirus, where people manipulate the Asian community such that we're one of the lowest uptakes of the vaccine. Because you see people that they are scholars, they are knowledgeable people, they might even be righteous people, but they don't disclose that they're not an expert, that they don't know what they're talking about, they're not researched in this, or that they haven't been exposed to the truth. And that 10% of the mix makes it very difficult to recognize the truth. And the Prophet ﷺ says in a hadith, a lengthy hadith, that one of the first people to be entered into hellfire is a scholar. And what's interesting is this person is so deluded that when he's asked by Allah, when he's being dragged to hellfire, he says he will be brought and Allah will make him recount his blessings. Then he will ask, what did you do with these blessings? He says, I acquired knowledge, I disseminated it, I recited Quran seeking your pleasure. And Allah, who knows all the truth and can't be fooled, will say, you're a liar. You read this in order to be called such and such that you can earn such and such, and you were given it and you earned it. But these people who tell these half-truths, these false truths, often are deceiving themselves. Now, what's the moral of this khutbah? What's the purpose of what I want you to take away today? Is that truth is something that's integral to our faith. Allah calls Himself al-haq, which is the truth. There's no mix and match. And we have to do everything in our ability to find the 100% truth. And we should investigate and find out. And truth can be used as a weapon to manipulate against people. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says, when there's a man and a woman alone in a room, the third person is shaitan, because he can manipulate that situation to take advantage. At the very worst, to spread rumors, and at the very least, to spread rumors, and at the very worst, to encourage them to do the haram. Truth is something sacred, and we should verify and we should be careful who we take it from. And whenever we see information, we should ask ourselves, is it correct and is it useful? And Every time we speak, we'll be held accountable for the words that we speak. So when we say something, we should be careful that what we say is true. And when we hear something, before we tell someone else, we should be careful that what we heard was right before we share it. It's a shame that our community, amongst all communities, is the one that people look at and say there's so many conspiracies amongst them. It's a shame that when our tradition is knowledge, when the first words of our faith came down to read, that we've neglected this idea of finding truth. And remember, things are never black and white. It's the shades of grey that you need to be careful of. It's when you hear something from someone you trust, that sounds correct, that makes sense, is when you need to check that it's true. Because that's when the 20%, the 10% lie comes in and it distorts the matter. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لكم. السلام عليكم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. Oh Allah, we ask you to show us the truth as truth and allow us to follow it, and allow us to see falsehood as falsehood and allow us to avoid it. Oh Allah, we ask you to make us people who verify all that we hear and that we follow that which brings us close to you and is beneficial to us, Ya Rabbal Alameen. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة وحي على الفلاح. قد غابت الصلاة وقد غابت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. فسبحان الله حين تمسون وحين تصبحون وله الحمد في السماوات والأرض وعشيا وحين تظهرون يخرج الحي من الميت ويخرج الميت من الحي ويحيي الأرض بعد موتها وكذلك تخرجون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله. Inshallah, if you can wait for the volunteers to direct people to leave, inshallah, one at a time, and leave the back rows first. So please wait your turn, and don't move around outside as well, inshallah. You can pray your sunnah, please.
Many of you did not actually register online, so you might stay outside if you are not registered. So